Hey everybody, it's Joan. I just want to give you a heads up before we start this episode. The stories you're about to hear get pretty serious, talking about drug use and self-harm.
I was pissed off all the time and volatile. Like, you want to fight? Let's fight. I was just so juiced up on so much stuff. I was just a walking hormone.
Meet Dan Nolte. Today, he's the pastor at Faith Presbyterian Church in the suburbs of Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's telling me about what he was like in the late 90s.
I got arrested in a barroom brawl. I was on drugs at the time, and it took 6 bouncers to take me down. I remember sitting in the cop car crying because I thought I just got traded to the Yankees and they're going to release me.
That's right, the New York Yankees. Before Dan Nolte was ordained, he played Major League Baseball at the height of the steroid era. That bar fight happened after the '98 season. And the drugs he references were a potent cocktail of anabolic steroids, speed, and alcohol. Nolte was taken to a police station in Southern California, where a cop combed through his wallet and discovered an MLB Players Association card.
And he says, "Is this you?" I'm like, "Yeah, I just got traded to the Yankees. Is there any way you guys could just let this go?"
He worried an arrest would derail his career. The Yankees were a dynasty, and to them, Dan Nolte was disposable. But what happened next? Well, it wasn't quite what he expected.
They called the bar, told the bar that I played Major League Baseball. "You sure you want to mess with this guy?" And the bar said, no, we don't want anything to do with that. Just let him go. And he goes, "Come with me." They used the mugshot machine to take pictures of me with them so that I could autograph them. I mean, that's just the way we were all treated.
Nolte may have been the last man on the Yankees roster, but in the eyes of the public, that didn't matter. He was a major leaguer, and that came with certain perks, like that get-out-of-jail-free card.
You just felt like you could do anything. You were bulletproof, and society kind of treated you that way. And I was just a little peon in this massive system. I mean, imagine what it's like for somebody who's got some real serious celebrity.
If he'd been, say, toiling away in Double-A, the police probably would have booked him in a second. But that wasn't Nolte's story. He'd only stayed in the minor leagues long enough to learn that he didn't have the talent to make it without the help of performance-enhancing drugs.
I stole Double-A job, Triple-A job, big league jobs. There's no way I would have ever made it to the levels I made it without those drugs. No way.
Nolte would only pitch one more season after that brush with the law. He was a mediocre reliever with an ERA over 4. And looking back, he says even that wouldn't have been possible without anabolic steroids. Up until now, I've talked about steroids as something baseball's biggest stars used to set records and put up Hall of Fame numbers. But the majority of users, you've never even heard of them. Still, their stories matter just as much as Barry Bonds or Mark McGwire's. That's because for every player who made it big, there were hundreds more who used steroids, not to make history, but to simply stay in the game. In this episode, I'll introduce you to 2, Dan Nolte and Jeremy Cummings. They never met. Their careers didn't overlap. Nolte was drafted in 1992, Cummings in 99. And over the years in between, everything changed. I'm Joan Neeson, and this is Crushed. Hi, everyone. It's Joan. A quick favor. We're conducting an audience survey, and we'd be really grateful if you could take a few minutes and answer some questions about Crushed. Please visit survey.prx.org/crushed to take the survey. Thanks.
DraftKings Sportsbook, America's top-rated sportsbook app, is putting you in the center of the action with endless ways to make it rain. From live betting to betting on your favorite players, they do it all. Check out the app every day this week to cash in on their daily odds boosts. And now, for a limited time, DraftKings Sportsbook is giving all new players a deposit bonus up to $1,000 when signing up using promo code CRUSHED. Must be 21 or older. New Jersey, Indiana, or Pennsylvania only. New customers only. Restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or in Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT.
This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp Online Counseling. Crush tackles some serious mental health topics, and telling this story has helped me understand just how much a person's mental health can drive the decisions and missteps they might make in life. Reaching out can be difficult, but BetterHelp makes the process easier. BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist, and you can start communicating in under 48 hours by video, phone, or even live chat. Our listeners get 10% off the first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/crushed. That's betterhelp.com/crushed.
I grew up in a rough area. Everybody was on welfare. Everybody was on HUD, and we fought a lot.
That's Jeremy Cummings. As a kid, he lived in a housing project near Charleston, West Virginia.
I remember a bunch of my friends and I, we played what we called tennis ball baseball, where we used, real bats, but used tennis balls. We busted a few windows.
But when it came time for organized sports, Cummings felt like he was at a disadvantage. His family couldn't afford the sign-up fees and gear, and they had to turn to a friend to help cover the costs. Plus, Cummings' dad wasn't able to coach his teams or hang around the field to lobby for his son.
He's a riverboat captain on the Mississippi River. So growing up, he was gone more than he was home. That's where I got my work ethic from, because he worked as a deckhand, which is just, they run a mill, you're just out there doing all the labor, and stuck with it and just worked all the way up.
He was also responsible for making Cummings a baseball fan, thanks to a souvenir he bought on a trip down the Mississippi.
And I remember, I think it was 82 or 85, he got to go to a World Series game, which was a St. Louis Cardinals game. And I ended up being a St. Louis Cardinal fan, an Ozzie Smith fan growing up, because he brought me back a pennant.
Cummings loved the Cardinals' 150-pound back-flipping shortstop. But he was also a child of the 80s, the perfect age to get hooked on the He-Man sensation. That Hulkamania workout kit we talked about last time, it was marketed to kids like Cummings.
I remember when WWF came out and I started watching it on Sundays. You had Hogan and Andre the Giant, and these dudes were just like, man, from another planet.
He was also a fan of Jose Canseco, Mark McGuire's Bash brother. He wore Canseco's jersey number one year in Little League, but he would never look a thing like the Slugger. In high school, Cummings tipped the scale at 170 pounds. He'd try to gain weight every year, but then basketball season would come around. He'd run sprints in a hot gym, sweating off pound after pound.
So I finally quit my senior year of playing basketball and just hit the weight room and put on about 15 pounds, got up to 185. But that's when I really knew that I had a chance to play college baseball. And it really was because I added weight, started throwing harder, and that's when people started noticing me.
How hard were you throwing at that point?
Like 82 to 85, which back then was decent, but now it's nothing.
So at that point, when you were being recruited, did you think I've got a shot at playing pro baseball, or was that still so far away at that point?
So far away, so far away. Never even thought of that, truthfully. I was just happy to go play college baseball. And I got books and tuition paid for.
So he packed his bags for the University of West Virginia. And for now, we'll leave him there in 1995 and return to Dan Nolte. 2 decades before that bar fight that I told you about earlier, Nolte was a terror on the t-ball field.
When I was little, t-ball used to be 3 innings tee and then 3 innings pitching, which was really dangerous, I think. At the time, you have all these 6-year-olds throwing the ball all over the place. And I threw harder than most kids. Also, I tended to not know exactly where the ball was going, which, when you're 6, people are frightened to death to get hurt.
But what qualified Nolte as a menace back then made him a solid pitcher once he learned a bit of control. By his senior year in high school, he was 6'6". But like Cummings, he was super skinny.
Everybody just told me continuously, if you could just gain weight, you'll throw 100 miles an hour. But I could never gain weight. I ate everything in sight. And so I had a real body complex and some real issues with it personally. Wouldn't take my shirt off around people, things like that. It was just very, very cognizant of the fact that I was very, very thin.
Word got around that there was a pitcher who'd do anything to put on a few pounds. Nolte talked to a friend of a friend who had a hookup for anabolic steroids. He placed an order.
But I never touched them, never did anything with it, and knew that was kind of always on the back burner, I guess.
That's right. Steroids were accessible to high schoolers in Southern California in the mid-'80s. It was the height of America's addiction to pumping iron. And though he didn't take them, this is where Nalty's PED story begins. With a bottle of pills he decided not to open. For the time being, Nalty was satisfied to stay clean and enroll in junior college. After 2 years, he transferred to Cal State Fullerton, a powerhouse program. He won plenty of games in college, but he was never able to just blow a pitch past a batter.
I think the hardest I threw was against Stanford, the first game of the year in February 1992, and I hit like 87 on the gun.
That was his senior season. Fullerton made it to the College World Series, but lost in the final game. And that June, the Twins picked Nalty in the 14th round of the MLB draft.
I think the main reason I got drafted was that I think they essentially forecasted to say, look, this guy's 6'6", he's won a lot of games, he knows how to win. If he could just gain weight, we might have a chance.
Nalty reported to short season A-ball, the lowest level of the minor leagues, and his doubts about his body intensified.
Every guy that trotted out to the mound was, they're throwing in the low 90s, every single one of them. And I was like, I can't touch that on my best day. I mean, you could move me 10 feet closer to home plate and I still couldn't throw that hard.
Nalty wasn't the only one who would feel that urgency. Let's return to West Virginia now, where Cummings faced a similar dilemma. In college, he was a good pitcher, nothing special, until the fall of his senior year. It was 1998, and baseball was all over the news. As a Cardinals fan, he couldn't get enough of the home run race.
Oh, it was super exciting. We watched a lot of ESPN back then. It was every day, every night.
That summer watching, did you have any inkling? Were you thinking steroids at all? Did that occur to you?
No, not at all.
And that wasn't part of the conversation in college at all? That wasn't part of your baseball world at that point?
No.
High schoolers in Southern California were ordering steroids like it was no big deal. But in Morgantown, West Virginia, college players had never set eyes on them. Still, Cummings knew that if he wanted to get drafted, he'd have to get bigger. So he hit the gym.
And I put on another 15 pounds. And my senior year was the first time I ever threw 90 miles an hour because of just working out more and harder and smarter.
That spring, a pro scout ended up coming to one of his games. The scout was actually there to watch a different player. But Cummings caught his eye when he hit 94 miles an hour on the radar gun.
My next start was the following Sunday. There was 11 or 12 scouts there. So things changed for me right then and there. And then that's when I finally realized, you know what, I might be able to get drafted.
His hunch was right. And it wasn't just any team that drafted him. The Cardinals took him in the 21st round. His signing bonus was all of $1,000.
But it was still fun. I did get a red bag and a red pair of spikes. So that was my signing bonuses.
When Cummings reported to the Cardinals system, he had the same wake-up call Nalty had.
I remember the first day in the locker room, there's this guy behind me. He's 6'5", big buff dude. And I'm like, man. It's how many home runs you hit this past year? I'm a pitcher. I'm like, oh gosh. The guy beside him's 6'1", just swollen. Just jacked. I'm like, where are you? Center field, left field? He goes, I'm a pitcher too. And I'm just like, there's no chance. I have no chance in professional baseball. All these guys are jacked and tall, and they're pitchers. It's the best of each college, gets drafted basically. So I went from, thinking I was all big hot stuff, and no, got humbled really quick.
It's a common sensation for rookies, and everyone reacts differently to the shock. Cummings put his head down. He'd tried to remake his body in college, and through dogged persistence, he'd succeeded. At this point, he had no reason to believe the minor leagues would be any different. This, now, is the fork in the road. Jeremy Cummings goes one direction, and Dan Nalty another. One will make it all the way to the World Series. The other will be called a cheater on TV and in newspapers across the country. The last time we heard from Dan Nalty, it was 1992, and he'd just reported to the Twins farm system. He felt too skinny, a step behind, totally unprepared. And when he suffered a minor injury, he decided to milk it. He wanted to go home early, back to California. At that point, he weighed 180 pounds. He knew he needed to do something drastic. So he hired a trainer and laid out his goals.
I want to throw 100 miles an hour and I've got to put on 50 pounds to do it. He said, no problem, I can do that. He said, I'll train you we'll train 6 days a week. You get Sunday off and you got to eat like you've never ate in your whole life. When you stress your body out that hard, your heart rate goes way up. I remember often going out into my car, just laying in my car because I was just pale white because I had just stressed my body so hard.
But that wasn't the end of Nolte's excruciating routine. On top of everything else, his trainer was injecting him with steroids every couple of days. This was central to their plan. But Nolte never paid attention to what exactly was being shot into his bloodstream.
I'm not asking enough questions. It was just total stupidity, but I was very focused on my goal.
The drugs kicked in quickly.
I was at one point gaining a pound a day. For me, that was just awesome. I'd step on the scale and I'd weigh a pound more and then a pound more. I'm like, these are the greatest drugs I've ever seen in my whole life. This is awesome. When
he reported the next season, Nolte had gained 20 pounds.
That was thrilling to me that I'd step on a scale and move the little thing over to 200, and they noticed, of course, because you weigh in at the beginning of spring training, and they could see that I was working hard at this.
Did you hear that? Working hard. That's how Nolte viewed what he was doing, period. He saw the steroid shots as just part of the package, a tool he needed to do his job. And it worked. In barely 5 months, he increased his velocity by 5 miles an hour.
I noticed pretty rapidly that I was throwing the ball differently. Just the ball coming out of my hand because I could just make my arm move faster. Everything was just moving faster. And then the coaches, of course, are coming to you and saying, good work. You're looking great. You're hitting 90, and they're telling you. So that was just all more affirming to what I was doing was working.
Not only was he throwing harder, steroids also got him the attention he'd always craved.
I lived in Southern California, so that physical appearance it's a big deal there.
Remember, this is the guy who'd refused to take his shirt off in public.
And people asking me if I played football was like the greatest compliment you could have ever given me in my whole life. Guys are drawn to guys that are big and strong. Like, man, how could I get arms like that? Or how could I have a six-pack like that? All that stuff. And I'd never heard those kinds of compliments before. So those were just like a drug. That in itself was a drug.
Steroids, unlike most illegal drugs, don't give users a high. But it's easy to see how a player could start to feel dependent on them.
In the second year, we started stacking drugs. So I would take 2 or 3 different kinds of steroids at one time to do different things. I was taking some that were just pure for muscle mass, just pure size. And then I was taking others that were for speed.
In 1995, when Nolte made it to AAA, he'd gone from 180 to 240 pounds. And though his transformation had been gradual, it still should have been obvious he was using steroids. But no one asked.
You just kind of kept it to yourself, but there was always the motto that if you're not cheating, you're not trying. That was just kind of the mentality of all of us. Some guys just took it a lot farther than other guys did, Some guys, for them, would think that not cheating, not trying is putting a little pine tar on your hat so you can grip the ball a little bit better. And then there are other guys like me who are pumping themselves full of drugs to get an advantage. But I think we all just generally understood this was wrong. It was cheating and you were stealing people's jobs.
After just 1 year in AAA, Nolte made the Twins' opening day roster. Steroids had fueled his journey to the big leagues. And once he got there, he wasn't about to stop juicing. In fact, he added another drug to his repertoire, amphetamines, which had been popular in baseball for years.
Speed was a never-ending energy and just laser beam focus. It was the most addictive drug I ever took. But that's what also triggered me becoming an alcoholic because I could never go to sleep. So you just get in this cycle where you get on this roller coaster ride you just can't get off of.
That was his in-season routine. Uppers to pitch, downers to fall asleep before the sun came up. He only used steroids during the off-season.
It wasn't until I got to the big leagues that I actually encountered other guys that were actually saying, you're not taking during the season? Oh man, you got to take during the season because you'll lose all the weight. I'm like, yeah, why didn't I ever think of that?
Nolte was throwing harder than ever, and he felt invincible. As crazy as it sounds today, back in the mid-90s, he had no fear of getting caught or punished for steroid use. That's because the MLB Players Association flat out refused to even discuss drug testing with the league. The PA called it an invasion of privacy and protected members from facing any kind of consequences. Nolte knew he'd never have to pee in a cup.
It's just there's nothing they could do about it. So we were essentially above the law, and that's just you got a bunch of really type A, really driven people, really wealthy people, 25 of them all in one room that now have no laws. It was a problem.
Nolte partied constantly, acted totally entitled.
And I'm sure the drugs did not help. I had one intention when I went out at night, and that was to get loaded and be with a woman at some point. And that happened a lot. And if you got in my way, then I just dismissed you and moved on. Like, I knew I held all the cards. Like, I'm the trophy. And if you want to be with the trophy, then you do what the trophy says.
His relationships were hollow, unfulfilling, manipulative. Nolte never questioned that behavior because on the mound, his aggression was the key to his success.
From a competitive standpoint, it was great, because you just had this real fire about winning and just beating you to a pulp.
But even that didn't last. Eventually, the drugs began to break his body down.
So after my first year in the big leagues, I had thoracic outlet syndrome, which is the vein doesn't pull the blood from my arm, so my hand wouldn't numb. So they had to cut my first rib out of my neck because there was no space. My neck was like so much bigger than my neck is now.
His body seemed to be fighting back against all that unnatural muscle. But after his surgery, he went home and started another course of steroids.
Next season, I was pitching in the Metrodome, and I tore my tricep tendon out of its socket. And this is typical of guys that use drugs because their muscles get so big, but your tendon doesn't get any bigger.
The best solution would have been to get smaller. That would have made sense. But Nolte's choices were no longer rational. So he kept juicing and kept getting hurt.
I was pitching in Cleveland, and I ripped the biggest tendon in my groin off my pelvis. That ended that year. That's when I got traded to the Yankees.
And that's when Nolte got in the bar fight and wound up signing autographs for cops. But the winter between the 98 and 99 seasons sticks out in his memory for another reason. It's when he decided he'd had enough. All those injuries, they'd shaken him. And he knew that if he kept getting hurt, the Yankees would be quick to cut him.
I just thought, maybe I don't need to be this big. Maybe I can stop using the drugs. I played the rest of that season mostly drug-free, aside from some speed here and there.
Nolte pitched in 33 games for the Yankees. By the end of the season, after nearly a year without steroids, he'd lost 15 pounds and a ton of velocity. He was back pitching at the same speed he had in college.
So, there was a direct correlation between using the drugs and velocity. And I was nowhere near the guy that I once was before.
The Yankees won the World Series that October. Nolte didn't pitch in the postseason, but he'd still get a ring. And the night they clinched, he celebrated just as hard as the team's biggest stars, staying out until sunrise with friends.
About 7 o'clock in the morning, we get back in the limousine to go back home. And I told the limousine driver to please stop so I could sit in the front seat with him. And I just started talking to him about life and just wanted to know, is there more to life than this? We just won the World Series, and the streets aren't paved gold, and I'm not riding on clouds, but I feel just as miserable now as I did before. And so we got to the George Washington Bridge, and I told them to stop. You take them home, and I'm going to jump. I said, I'm done.
Nolte didn't go through with it. Traffic, of all things, saved him. It was rush hour. His driver couldn't have stopped if he'd wanted to.
I was just crashing and burning. If the World Series and all the money and playing for the Yankees isn't going to fix my life, then nothing is going to fix my life.
Over the past year, Nolte had quit steroids, cut down on amphetamines, and tried to drink less. Without that blend of uppers, downers, and performance enhancers, his brain went haywire. He'd built his body up, and then it had broken down, all in service of what exactly? After the World Series, Nolte knew he was done with steroids for good. He'd never play in another major league game.
Baseball was my God. I mean, it drove every decision I made. You do anything at all costs to experience your dream. And of course, I wasn't really experiencing my dream. I was experiencing hell.
Stay with us. Odoo is a suite of business apps, but what does that really mean? You're on your computer, maybe in your PJs, maybe not. You have a tab open with a dashboard of applications, one for every department in your company. There's manufacturing, accounting, website, purchase, and more. You click on the CRM app and reach out to new opportunities. Then you click on the inventory app to make sure your stock levels are good before clicking on the sales app to send a quote to a customer. How many tabs do you have open? Just one. Odoo makes things simple. Go to odoo.com/sports to start a free trial. That's odoo.com/sports. Crushed is brought to you by Progressive, one of the country's leading providers of auto insurance. With Progressive's Name Your Price tool, you say what kind of coverage you're looking for and how much you want to pay, and Progressive will help you find options that fit within your budget. Use the Name Your Price tool and start an online quote today at progressive.com. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Steroids got Dan Nolte where he'd always wanted to go, onto the best team in baseball, all the way to a championship. But that same year, 1999, Jeremy Cummings was learning the miserable facts of life as a minor leaguer.
So a lot of people don't realize how much, I'm thinking I'm a professional athlete. I'm going to be rich. I do remember after my first paycheck, it's $314. I called my mom and told her I need help paying my car payment. I had to call my mom as a professional athlete for money, which is pretty sad.
That first offseason, Cummings moved back to his parents' house in West Virginia. He gave baseball and basketball lessons to kids, scrimping and saving to chase his dream. That became his routine. Play baseball for pennies in the summer, work odd jobs each winter. For a few off seasons, he waited tables at Olive Garden and Outback Steakhouse. Then, in his fourth year in the minors, he was finally promoted to Double-A, just 2 levels below the big leagues. That's where he first saw players using steroids.
But I was like, man, I'm up to Double-A. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I was like, it's not for me.
The next year, Cummings made it all the way to Triple-A without steroids. He was on the brink of making the Cardinals roster, but he wasn't promoted.
Led that team in wins. I was 15-5 that year. They sent me back down to Double-A the next year.
It was his 6th minor league season, and he was only earning $2,000 a month, 8 months a year. Nowhere near a living wage. And the odds were against him advancing much further. Only about 10% of minor leaguers ever make it to the majors. But here's the thing. Those other players who were passing him by, they didn't have his mechanics. Their pitches didn't move like his did. But they did have one thing he didn't: velocity. And Cummings suspected that came from steroids. Meanwhile, he was back throwing in the mid-80s, and he was about to reach a breaking point.
I saw the reward of the financial gain that those other guys were getting. They were getting they were going to the big leagues, period. And when you're in the big leagues, you're making what I was making in a month, they were making in a day, if not more than that.
Unable to make a living playing baseball in the U.S., Cummings started playing winter ball in Venezuela. There, he earned higher wages, enough to at least cover his bills.
2 months of work over there is what I was making for 8 months over here.
He loved Venezuela, but he also noticed that almost everyone on his team took steroids. But that didn't bother him like it did back home. The drugs got the Venezuelans jobs, which helped them support their families.
I thought poor in West Virginia was poor. No, not even close. Not even close to what they have to deal with. So I understand why they would take steroids, why they would want to change their lifestyle, because it sets up generations of their families.
Major league money would have changed Cummings' life too, and his mindset began to shift.
I'm not scared of needles. I wasn't scared of needles, wasn't scared of the pain or any of that. It was just a mental conflict of good versus evil. Like, it was just weighing on me not to do it or to do it, not to do it or to do it.
We didn't hear any of that debate from Dan Nolte. In 1992, there was no moral element to his choice. Steroids were just part of a training program. But 12 years later, Cummings' decision to use was charged. At this point, steroids were everywhere. The home run record had fallen twice to men who were more than likely juicing. Journalists and fans questioned if this was wrong, a violation. But in Venezuela, steroids weren't at all stigmatized, and Cummings made his move. He asked teammates where he could get some. One was nice enough to write out the names of the drugs he'd want in Spanish, so he could simply hand the slip of paper to a pharmacist.
It's like going to the counter at the CVS here. Walked in, ordered it, walked away with it.
Drugs in hand, he had one final hurdle to overcome: his fear of getting busted.
My mind kept telling me, what if I got caught? What if I get caught? What if I get caught?
You see, baseball was suddenly desperate to look like it was taking action. Steroid use had become too obvious to ignore. So in 2001, minor league baseball began testing its players, who had no union to protect them. They were underpaid, vulnerable, collateral damage. But by the spring of 2002, the players' union had run out of arguments. It agreed to gradually phase testing into the big leagues. And starting in 2004, the year Cummings finally crossed the line, no one was exempt from punishment.
But all those guys were telling me, you don't have to worry about it. You take it over here. You stop taking it at the beginning of December. It's out of your system by the time spring training rolls around. They told me exactly what to do.
He was getting this advice from his teammates. But that was good enough medical counsel for Cummings. He decided it was now or never. After years of holding out, he was going to use. And he remembers it vividly.
Just go in the mirror, make sure you're far enough away from your butt crack and stick it in your butt. And I was doing it, and as soon as I did it, man, blood squirted out. And I was just like, oh, yeah. So the next time I had somebody else do it for me.
That winter, Cummings bought 2 different steroids and stacked them. He believed both would be out of his system by the time he got home. The only problem was he took a way higher dose than he should have.
They were telling me to take it twice a week. I was taking it 3 to 4 times a week. So I was just doubling up.
And he was throwing harder, almost immediately. 90 miles an hour, 91, 92, 93, all the way up to 94 again. Not only that, he looked different.
My face got fat. Everything kind of just got swollen. Like everything did.
Were there any other negative side effects that you had?
Balls are smaller now.
Wow.
No, they still work. I have 4 kids. But they're definitely, and I wouldn't say necessarily smaller, but there's definitely a noticeable change.
So, yeah, that stereotype of steroid use proved true, at least for Cummings. Still, the pros far outweighed the cons. He had pitched so well in Venezuela that when he returned home, he got an unexpected phone call. For the first time ever, the Cardinals invited him to Major League spring training. He had 2 weeks to pack his bags for Florida.
So I was like, all right, here we go. I'm going to the big leagues now.
This was why he'd taken steroids, for this opportunity. Things were going just as he'd hoped.
Some of my friends that hadn't seen me since the year before, like, man, you were big. Like, what you been doing? Like, just working out. And then that's when I was like, oh, crap, man, I might get caught here.
And that's when he was handed a cup to pee in. Cummings took the test. And when spring training ended, the Cardinals assigned him to their AAA team in Memphis, where he waited.
3-4 weeks goes by and you don't hear anything. So I'm like, okay, it's out of my system. So I thought I beat the system in a sense by taking it in the wintertime like everybody else was doing.
But he wasn't in the clear. His results just took longer than he'd expected. And his test came back positive for anabolic steroids. He was facing a 15-game suspension.
Felt bad, felt ashamed. What am I going to tell my parents? What are the other players going to think about me? Cost my family embarrassment because I was on CNN, news ticker, and parents and childhood friends started calling them. Like, what is going on?
Cummings never thought to contest the decision. He owned what he'd done and called a doctor.
I told him, yes, I took them. Haven't taken anything since December. How do I get this out of my system? And he goes, well, this will probably take you 12 to 14 months to get out of your system.
That was a huge problem. The Cardinals told Cummings that if he tested positive again, they'd cut him. Plus, baseball would suspend him for 30 games. And if the drugs lingered in his system for even a couple more months, he'd fail his next test without even using again.
He's like, the only thing I know to do is to drink more water and to lose body fat. So that time I was probably 215, 220 pounds. I just started running and drinking water and changed my diet, stopped eating fatty foods, stopped going out. My body completely changed from muscular to like a rail.
Cummings never failed another steroid test, but his timing couldn't have been worse. That positive came within a month of Mark McGwire refusing to discuss his own PED use in front of Congress. In the years since fans had staunchly defended McGwire's right to take whatever supplement he wanted, things had changed in a big way. 2005, the year Cummings got caught, was the height of steroid hysteria, when teams were terrified to be associated with anyone who'd been caught using. So after all that, St. Louis cut him. Then the Phillies picked him up, and he pitched a no-hitter for their AAA squad. In 2008, he won a bronze medal with the U.S. Olympic team. But his career sputtered out. Cummings retired without making the major leagues. And maybe he never would have gotten there, no matter what he did, no matter what anyone else did. Still, he can't help but wonder if the steroids he thought would save his career ended up ruining it.
I was a moral person, wasn't trying to cheat, but then I kept seeing it, kept seeing them get paid, kept seeing guys that weren't as good as me become better than me because they were cheating. So it just kept pushing me to a brink, and I broke.
I was a teenager when baseball started cracking down on steroid users, and I remember the messaging clearly. These guys are bad. They did something wrong. But I also remember feeling conflicted, like the conversation was missing something. Still, I absorbed the message about immorality and ethics, and that steroids were all kinds of awful. Then I met Cummings and Nolte and heard their stories. And it made me think of something Stan Conti, the Giants trainer I talked to in the last episode, told me.
I understand a homeless person robbing a 7-Eleven. I'm against robbery, but I understand it. I don't condone it, but I understand it. A billionaire walking into 7-Eleven and stealing, I got a problem with. He doesn't need to do it. And that's what you saw with the superstars.
Neither player we spoke to in this episode was anything close to a superstar. And Conti is right. It's possible to understand why someone would cheat without applauding it. But that nuance, it's still missing from the conversation around steroids. Cummings and Nolte were just trying to get ahead in a broken system. They own what they did.
You got to be a man and live up to it. Like, this is the way I feel about it. You know, it took me a while to do that, but that's just part of life. You did it, man up to it, and move on.
I found Jeremy Cummings' name when I was compiling a list of all the minor leaguers suspended for steroid use in the first 5 years of testing. I'd never heard of him. I'd never heard of any of them. But I contacted dozens of those players, and Cummings was one of the few who responded. He lives back in West Virginia now with his wife and kids, and he coaches youth sports. He agreed to an interview immediately, then another, then a third. He had a lot to say.
I've never told this story to people outside of my little circle, in a sense. Yeah, it actually feels good.
Nolte's career as a minister has led to a ton of reflection, and he's talked about steroids often over the years. Sometimes he even wonders what his life might have looked like if he'd taken a different path.
I got drafted on my own natural talent. So go off and play A-ball, realize I'm not good enough to get out of A-ball, and be content with that.
But it's hard to blame him for being tempted, for giving in. When Nolte was playing, baseball ignored PEDs, implicitly condoning them. But sometime in the early 2000s, the rules changed.
If I would have came through early 90s with my skill set, I'd have pitched in the big leagues. Nobody would have been able to Google my name and saw Jeremy Cummings steroids.
Today, Cummings has young kids. They don't have a clue their dad used steroids, and he doesn't plan to tell them, unless they search his name on the internet someday. If that happens, he says he won't lie to them. But when I asked if he regrets taking the drugs, his answer surprised me.
I guess if I had to do it over, I would have done it a year or two earlier when those other guys were taking them.
So for you, you felt that baseball had just created a situation where the only way to get ahead was to cheat.
Yes.
Talking to Cummings and Nolte made me realize my understanding of PEDs stopped at baseball stars. Everything I'd heard and read had framed steroids and the men who used them as sinister, unbearably selfish. But these two pitchers, they were none of those things. And their stories are evidence of the vast gray area between right and wrong. We don't want to see that, though. It's so much easier to ignore the complexity of the situation and instead assign blame. Next time on Crushed.
Now, is that cheating? Are they going to look at me and say, Mike, you're not getting in a Hall of Fame because you did that? I mean, come on.
Where exactly is the line that players should never cross? Does it move? Evolve? And in baseball, where there's always been a massive gray area between following the rules and cheating, how do we know when someone's gone too far? Crushed is written and reported by me, Joan Neeson. Jessica Popovac is our senior producer. Our associate producer is Devin Manzi, and our production assistant is Megan Coyle. Michael Garofalo is our editor. Jane Ackerman fact-checked the series, and Dan DeZula mixed this episode. Gotham Chopra, Amit Sankaran, and Adam Schlossman are our executive producers. Special thanks to Lisa Pollock and to composer Michael Kramer. If you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts, reach out for help. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is open 24 hours a day at 800-273-8255. Crushed is a production of Religion of Sports and PRX. If you like the show, please follow us and leave us a review wherever you do your listening. On behalf of everyone on the Crush team and at Religion of Sports, we want to thank sponsors Odoo, Progressive, DraftKings, and BetterHelp Online Counseling for supporting the show and its creators during our launch.